Even before police had confirmed the identity of the Tumbler Ridge mass shooting suspect, anger and false claims about the shooter's gender identity were being circulated online. And in the days since the RCMP revealed that the suspect was transgender, pundits and politicians and news outlets have been posting about what they call an epidemic of violence by trans people. According to experts and data, there is no evidence to support these claims. In fact, according to U.S. statistics, trans people are statistically underrepresented when it comes to carrying out mass shootings. Well, Kevin Maimann is a senior writer for CBC News. He has written a story about this, and he joins us now from Edmonton. Kevin, good morning to you.
Good morning, Stephen. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for taking the time with us. Can you just give us some examples of the kind of rhetoric you have seen online and exactly what people are saying about trans people and violence?
Yeah, so, as soon as this happened, a lot of people were using phrases like another trans shooter, implying that trans people are regularly carrying out mass shootings, which we know is not the case. And a lot of people talking about a so-called trans violence epidemic, saying this is a national emergency, saying, trans people are extreme and mentally ill. There was a right-wing Canadian media outlet that used the phrase trans horror show. So it was some pretty inflammatory stuff, and this was, happening early before the shooter was even identified.
And we know that the vast majority of shooters, certainly if you look at, a country like the United States, it has where school shootings and mass shootings are a fairly frequent activity. As far as I can tell from evidence, the vast majority of shooters are cisgender white males.
Yes, yeah, that's what the data shows.
Okay. So, the people making these comments, though, I mean, these are not just faceless people behind keyboards. Some people are actually putting their names to this. Can you tell us about the posts from independent Kelowna MLA Tara Armstrong?
Right. So Tara Armstrong, yeah, an independent MLA in BC, made several social media posts on Wednesday about what she calls transgender ideology, saying it's radicalizing youth, unlocking violent impulses. And, again, hours before the shooter was even identified, she wrote this very long post saying there's an epidemic of transgender violence spreading across the West. Says she encourages parents to help fight this epidemic. And so, yeah, these are kinds of posts that are, obviously going to rile some people up.
So does she provide any evidence at all, though, to come to that conclusion? I mean, it doesn't seem to be supported by much.
No, no one posting this kind of stuff was sharing any kind of evidence to support it.
All right. Other prominent pundits are weighing in as well. Tell me about a little bit of that.
Yeah, so you have a lot of the usual suspects, people who are it's known to stir things up online from a certain perspective, but this made its way south of the border, and the American political commentator Matt Walsh was among those weighing in. He said on X that trans people, quote, are the most dangerous and unstable group in existence. Again, saying this with no evidence to support this claim. Also saying that trans people account for the most mass shooters per capita, which is not even close to being true. It's important to note that this guy has 4 million followers on this platform,
Yeah.
and many of whom presumably respect and value his opinions. So, these are people with serious reach spreading this misinformation.
Right. And you've looked into this much more deeply than I have. I mean, I've been looking at the stats all morning, but what does the evidence actually show?
So, James Densley, who I spoke with, is the co-founder of the Violence Prevention Project. He's a criminologist in the States. They track mass shootings in the US since 1966. And yeah, he says these claims can be clearly refuted by evidence. He says so in the US, from his database, 97.5% of mass shootings were carried out by cisgender men, 2% by cisgender women, which leaves 0.5% carried out by people who are trans, making them statistically underrepresented. And those stats are fairly narrow. His numbers don't include gang violence, family violence, and they only include incidents where 4 or more people were killed. So there's other people who do who track this more broadly. And then if you look at the gun violence archive, their numbers actually show trans individuals are responsible for less than 0.1% of mass shootings in the US in the last 12 years. So no matter how you slice it, trans folks are underrepresented in these stats and not overrepresented.
And what did you hear then from advocates about the effect that this kind of anti trans rhetoric is having?
Yeah, so advocates I spoke with, he said that they feel less safe right now at a time when trans rights are already being rolled back in some places, and we're already seeing a lot of anti-trans rhetoric online. So there's a feeling that this reaction was unfortunately predictable, and there's a concern that it's going to spark another wave of hatred. But I think a point that is important to make as well is that the advocates I spoke with felt very frustrated by the fact that they're having to talk about this at all, right? They're mourning, they're grieving this shooting, just like the rest of Canada. They never asked to be centered in this conversation, and they did not ask to be in this position where they're sort of having to shift their focus now from processing this tragedy to defending themselves and almost justifying their own existence.
And so, why do experts then think that these perceptions persist?
So the criminologist I spoke with, James Densley, says that these false perceptions that there are more mass shootings carried out by trans people can be attributed in part to what's known as base rate neglect, or this idea that even a couple incidents happening within a short period of time can start to seem like a pattern, even when it's not a pattern. Particularly because when a shooter is transgender, that fact sort of becomes the story, right? Especially on social media. Whereas if the shooter is a white male, it's never really mentioned, or their identity is never really mentioned. So this creates what he calls an asymmetry in the coverage, where people will recall these, quote unquote, unusual cases because they were unusual. And I think that's true. And I think there's another sort of darker element here that's driven by social media, where these platforms encourage inflammatory rhetoric because obviously that's what drives their engagement, that's what drives the revenue. So I think this sort of discourse is always going to be amplified online. And I think it's important for Canadians to keep in mind that we need to use our critical thinking skills when we're on the internet.
Right. And of course, trans people not the only minority communities who get stereotyped in this way. What other examples does your expert James Densley talk about?
Yeah, so he compares this to the way Muslim Americans were stereotyped after the September 11th attacks. And I'm sure that every Muslim who was in Canada at the time felt that backlash as well. He mentions how, young black men have been stereotyped as violent in this way. So, this is history repeating itself in a lot of ways where the actions of few are projected onto all members of a minority group, despite a complete lack of evidence to justify any of these stereotypes.
Hmm.